Hi, greetings. It's me, Dr. Paul Gerhardt, and today I want to talk about establishing a bargaining unit and organizing a campaign. Now, I know that we have people in classes that are both pro-union and anti-union, and no matter what side that you land on, you really have to be able to understand the processes and some of the terms that are involved. So I want to talk about those things in this video. So we're going to talk about bargaining unit determination, a little bit about union structure, bargaining unions in public sectors, public sector unions, organizing a drive, organizing union strategies, avoidance strategies by management, and representation election procedures. So let's get started. So, talking about appropriate bargaining unit, the group of employees that are determined by the NLRB to be an appropriate union for collective bargaining purposes. After a bargaining unit is identified, the employees of that union have the right to select their bargaining representative, and usually a labor union. So the bargaining unit itself is a particular group of employees represented by the union in collective bargaining. And the appropriate union, the basic underlying principles for the NLRB's determination of an appropriate union is that only employees having a substantial mutuality of interests in wages, hours, and working conditions can be appropriately grouped in that union. So, what is collective bargaining? So, here are some terms employments generally include. Price of labor, which is wages and benefits, work rules, hours of work, job classification, the amount of effort required, enforcement and administrative procedures, management, and union rights. Community of interest, history of bargaining, employee wishes, employee unionization, unit of employer organizational structure, public interests, stipulated units, and supervisors. These are things that are appropriate to bargain for. Some types of units for bargaining include the craft units. These are composed exclusively of workers having a recognized skill, and they're distinct from others in the unit by virtue of the skilled, non-repetitive nature of its work. Departmental units are another type of units, and they're composed of members of one department in a larger organization. They have separate units created by examining differences in skills, training, degree of common supervision, interchange with employees outside the department, and the performance rating system. So one employer and multiple locations are something else, other units. And this can be a petition for a single facility unit, and it is presumed to be an appropriate bargaining unit if the unit has a separate identity. Multi-employer units also, and these are groups of related employers and representatives of their workers. And then residual workers. These are odd collections of workers with common work situation or proximity of workplaces. So sometimes there aren't other groups of people will join other groups in order to have more strengths in bargaining. And then there are remaining units, and these are groups that are separate from primary production and maintenance groups. And then construction industry units, and we have to consider the 1974 health care amendments. The NLRB approved 8 basic health care units, and then health care institution units. So let's talk about types of unions. So we talked a little bit about craft unions. In one craft, one union. You know, butcher's union or the electricity unions, or the steel workers unions are some good examples. Members organized on a basis of craft or skill, and they have stringent apprenticeship programs. And then business agents with a full-time administrator, contract administration, and then a hiring hall. And then there are stewards, and these are the eyes and ears of the business agent. These are the people who actually work for the companies, and they are employees of the companies, but they also have strong ties with the union and keep the union people informed. So let's talk a little bit more about union structure. There are industrial unions. One shop, one union is the philosophy, and they organize all workers at one workplace regardless of the type of job they have. And then local unions typically are affiliated with a national union, and national unions may negotiate a master agreement, and local unions negotiate separate agreement covering all the local issues. Members often join because of a union shop agreement, and they are administered by elected officials, and officials typically are full-time employees at each workplace. There are different levels of unions. As we talked about, there are local unions, and there's an organizational component of a national union, and they handle day-to-day operations of collective bargaining and agreement. There are local officers, and those officers of local unions are usually elected positions for fixed terms, and the positions often include a president, a vice president, a secretary, treasurer, sergeant at arms, business manager or agent, and a steward. There are bylaws for each local union that are created, and they're voted on and approved. There's the national or international unions, and they have a relationship with subordinate local unions, and they're determined by each union's constitution, bylaws, and charters. Officers are elected to act in concert with policies established by the convention, and to provide services to the local union. And they are very important for political and representative roles on behalf of local unions. There are intermediate organizational unions, and there's relational or district officers with trade councils and conference boards, and joint councils often bring various crafts together. So let's talk a little bit about federations of unions, like the AFL-CIO of 1955. It's not a union itself. It's composed of national and international unions, and they assist in mediation and resolution of disputes between affiliated unions. And so you have to be aware of the AFL-CIO organizational chart, or any kind of organization that you're dealing with, so that you understand how things really work. So unions really have to have people who want change in order to win. And a new union federation of national unions must be dedicated to growing their membership through strategic organizational campaigns and improving the living standards of workers. These are the things that get people motivated. There are independent unions that are not designed along either the craft or the industrial unit model to open their membership employees for a specific professional occupation. Most public sector unions have roots in professional organizations that were developed prior to the widespread public sector collective bargaining. You know, some examples of these are the National Education Association, or the NEA, the International Association of Firefighters, the IAFF, the American Federation of Government Employees, the AFGE, and the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, or the AFSCM. And so when you are organizing drives, or when unions organize drives, A movement is initiated by dissatisfied employees or a union organizer to submit a representation petition to the NLRB and win a representation election, thus providing union certification and collective bargaining. So let's talk a little bit about the organizing process. It's initiated by employees or a union organizer. And then the union creates a strategy to organize employees, and management creates a strategy usually to keep the employees out. There's volunteer recognition by the employer, there's a representative election, there's a petition, there's an investigation by the NLRB and campaigns by both sides. Then there's a secret ballot, and it's either certified or rejected. And then if it's certified, the contract for bargaining begins. So let's talk about union organizing strategies. Step 1, build an organizing committee. Step 2, determine the issues. Step 3, choose a union recognition strategy. Card check recognition, strike for recognition, call for an LRB sponsored election, and step 4, the union recognition status. Something called salting that you should be aware of. And this is when members are encouraged by their union to seek employment at a non-union company. Once hired, then they promote unionization. And then the union may supplement their regular pay to provide equity with a union wage. So we used to see, and it still happens, employers who unions who find organizations where they want to grow more membership, and they introduce people into those organizations, and then those people create a network and relationships, and they start the process going. We have to be aware that there are union avoidance strategies by management too. And in many workplaces, it's management's goal simply to keep the union out. And that strategy is to convince the workers that unionization will do more harm than good. And then management may attempt to ensure workers that their present pay and benefits are competitive and may show data to prove it. So there may be some founding there. Management tips for campaigns. And things managers may not do, they are told to remember as tips. So they can't threaten employees, they can't interrogate employees, they can't make promises, and they can't spy. And so that's the analogy of tips. 4 is another thing, and that managers can do to discourage unions. They can help people understand the facts, they can share their opinions, they can recognize rules, and they can share their experience. So that's the 4. Counter-salting steps. You can pre-screen as many applicants as a manager as possible to ensure that you're hiring the most qualified person for any opening that the organization may have. And you can use consensus interviewing. An application should say list entire employment history, starting with the present employer, and ensure that applications show entire work history with no gaps in employment, and then check references thoroughly. Very often, when you see as you know, when you see a gap on a resume of employment, that could be a big red light saying that there's an issue with that person. So the best thing to do is find out what happened in that time period too. You want to hire the best employee for the job, right? So organizing at the workplace. The NLRB and the courts have devised rules to balance the right to engage in organizational campaigns and around the workplace at the employer's right to maintain a work environment. There's distribution of union materials, union buttons or insignias, bulletin boards, meeting hall and mailboxes, email solicitation, and a no solicitation policy. There may be picketing during an organizational campaign, and it's about targeting an employer. And there's, under the Act, a union can picket a primary employer, but for only 30 days before being required to file a petition for an election with the NLRB. There may be mass picketing, violence, or threats of violence, and none of these are allowed. And so nor is secondary picketing allowed. There is an election process that we talked about for representative elections, and the first step is a representation petition. The RC petition filed on behalf of an employee or a union to determine the support of representation in collective bargaining or certification. RM petition filed by the employer to determine support for representation in collective bargaining, and then RD petition, filed by the employer, employee, or union to determine whether a recognized union still has employees' support. Step number 2 is the investigation. So the NLRB regional director determines whether to conduct an election. Checks for appropriateness of the bargaining unit, and the employer must provide a list of eligible employees, names, addresses to the petitioning union. In step 3, that's when the secret ballot election happens, and the NLRB ensures that representation election is fair, honest, and gives employees free choice. The election may be invalidated due to actions of the employer and employees or third parties, and there could be a runoff election, and that may be used if one or more of the union is seeking representative rights, if none of the choices receives a majority of the votes. Step 4, certification of election results. The NLRB satisfied the results reflect the employee's free choice. And with certifications, there's a variety of benefits to the union. Exclusive representative rights. For 1 year, the employer is obligated to bargain. A 2005 study found that 90% of newly certified unions successfully negotiated a contract within the first year. However, in previous decades, union rates were 60%. For 1 year, no other union can challenge representation rights. Representation elections have voluntary recognition, a card check or strike, and employers must recognize the union without an election. And they may result from union pressure tactics. The Gesell doctrine is where the NLRB may issue a bargaining order in response to employers' unfair labor practices, and then traditional remedies may be deemed inadequate to eradicate effects of employer tactics. Prohibited conduct during an election. Campaign propaganda and misrepresentation is prohibited. You cannot threaten people with the loss of benefits. You can't promise or grant benefits. Interrogation and polling of employees cannot be done. You cannot have surveillance over employees, and you cannot be involved in the polling activity. If you want a little bit of information about decertification elections, this is the process of removing unions as a certified representative of employees within a bargaining unit. There has to be a secret ballot election conducted by the NLRB to determine a majority opinion. Factors must be, these are some of the factors that should be present in situations in which unions are discertified. Employer recently treated employees better. Employer waged an aggressive anti-union campaign, or the employer moves to a traditionally non-union geographic area. The union is perceived by a majority of its members as being unresponsive, and a female minority and younger workers may lose confidence in the union because its declining public image and aging leaders. So with elections in the public sector employees may not be able to prohibit non-employee union agents access to the workplace because the workplace is a public area. And then there are rules governing public employer pre-election activities during an organizational campaign, generally mirror private sector type restrictions. So finally, there is an exclusive representation, both a practice and a principal law. It gives real power to unions' bargaining positions, and there's some simplification in the bargaining process that needs to be understood, and we have to have consistent administration of labor contracts once they are agreed upon in the public sector. So, in a nutshell, that's what you need to know about establishing a bargaining unit and organizing a campaign. Whether you're an employer or you're an employee, the processes really do need to be understood. Thank you so much for your valuable time. I hope that you've taken something away from this video, and more than anything else, I hope that you have a great day, because only you get to choose how you feel about it. I'm Dr. Paul.